I'm going to read a couple of one long story and a couple of short ones, and then another piece. And so you should know what's happening, right? Okay. Okay. This story is called Friends. To put us at our ease, to quiet our hearts as she lay dying, our dear friend Selina said, "Life, after all, has not been an unrelieved horror. You know, I did have many wonderful years with her." She pointed to a child who leaned out of a portrait on the wall, long brown hair, white pinafore, head and shoulders forward. "Eagerness," said Susan. Anne closed her eyes. On the same wall, 3 little girls were photographed in a schoolyard. They were in furious discussion. They were holding hands. Right in the middle of the coffee table, framed in autumn colors, a handsome young woman of 18 sat on an enormous horse, aloof, disinterested, a rider. One night this young woman, Selina's child, was found in a rooming house in a distant city, dead. The police called. They said, "Do you have a daughter named Abby?" "And with him, too," our friend Selina said. "We had good times, Max and I. You know that." There were no photographs of him. He was married to another woman and had a new stalwart girl of about 6, to whom no harm would ever come, her mother believed. Our dear Selina had gotten out of bed, heavily but with a comic dance. She soft-shoed to the bathroom, singing. Those were the days, my friend. Later that evening, Anne, Susan, and I were enduring our 5-hour train ride to home. After 1 hour of silence and 1 hour of coffee and the sandwiches Selina had given us, she actually stood, leaned her big, soft, excavated body against the kitchen table to make those sandwiches, and said, "Well, we'll never see her again." "Who says? Anyway, listen," said Susan. "Think of it. Abby isn't the only kid who died then. What about that great guy? Remember Bill Dalrymple? He was a non-cooperator. And Simon, Matthew, Jeannie. Remember Mike? Remember Al Lurie? He was murdered on 6th Street, and that little kid Brenda who OD'd on your roof, Anne? The tendency, I suppose, is to forget. You people don't remember them." "What do you mean, you people?" Anne asked. "You're talking to us." I began to apologize for not knowing them all. Most of them were older than my kids, I said. Of course, the child Abby was exactly in my time of knowing and in all my places of paying attention. The park, the school, our street. But it's true. Selina's Abby was not the only one of that beloved generation of our children, murdered by cars, lost to war, to drugs, to madness. Selina's main problem, Anne said, she didn't tell the truth. What? A few hot, human, truthful words are powerful enough, Anne thinks, to steam all God's chemical mistakes and society's slimy lies out of her life. We all believe in that power, my friends and I, but sometimes the heat. Anyway, I always thought that Selina had told us a lot. For instance, we knew she was an orphan. There were 6, 7 other children. She was the youngest. She was 42 years old before someone informed her that her mother had not died in childbirthing her. It was some terrible sickness. And she had lived close to her mother's body, at her breast, in fact, until she was 8 months old. "Phew," said Selina. "What a relief. I always felt I was the one who killed her." "Your family stinks," we told her. "They really held you up for grief."
Great reading. And I guess we could begin by talking about your voice as a writer. Jane Cooper said in Leaning Forward, actually it's the afterword to Leaning Forward, the book of poems, that she compared you to Russian writers and to Chekhov in particular. And somebody else, I can't remember who it was, another critic said you wrote a little bit like Isaac Babel. I don't think you write like anybody else.
Oh.
So take it, great. Now, what I was going to ask you is, do you feel the singularity of your voice in fiction? Is this an impossible question to answer? Or do you think there's a neighborhood?
Just that when people would say that I wrote like Babel, I hadn't read him, at that when I first wrote my first book, and but I figured it out that some of it was that my parents came from around the same place he came from. Only he stayed there.
Right. And went with the
But the
Cossacks.
grandparents, you know, I figured there was a kind of a tune of some kind, or some kind of inflection, or word order, or something like
Syntax,
that. That maybe.
So when you read him, you felt
It has
this-
nothing. It has nothing to do really with reality. What I'm saying, but it's.
But you felt a kinship when you read it. That you, would you call it that? I mean, you know, apart from feeling influenced by him, which obviously didn't happen, you felt a kind of
Yeah, well,
connection.
I did. I mean, Russian writers were important in my house, and so.
Right. Now that leads into a question about poetry. You mentioned the two ears, which
Yeah.
we were talking about literature in the home, and poetry you wrote before you wrote fiction.
Yes.
And I want to ask you about Auden too, but you were saying that poetry was connected more to literature in a way, that
Yeah.
ear for literature.
Yeah.
And then fiction somehow allowed you to kick into the other or connect to
Yes.
the other
Yeah.
voices.
Yeah. Well, I wrote poetry because I was reading poetry and thinking poetry, and so in a sense, it really was much more related, as I realized later. I didn't realize this. I was really stuck at a certain point, and I think I hadn't learned to use my whole language.
Whole language.
Yeah,
Right.
I had only a part of my language. I only put that part of my language into the poetry that was literary, and it was many years before I understood that. And it was only when I began to write stories that I was able to kind of write poems with more of my whole
Being.
voice. Yeah.
And the two ears have to kind of balance in your imagination too. That's what
Yeah.
you're saying. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a way that they actually come together and then flow out again.
Yeah.
Right? Along with that, when you first started writing, you were very brave because your subject matter, quotes, and what you were writing about was not considered. It's not that it was taboo. It's just that people were not writing like that, right? I mean, there was you mentioned masculine quotes, fiction, whatever. You had to kind of go against the grain.
Yeah, well, you're right about that, but it's not a matter of bravery. I mean, it's when I began to write these stories, I began to write them because I had a lot of pressure to tell the stories about women, to tell these different ones, because actually the first couple of stories were really written about almost a generation before mine. Goodbye and Good Luck was like that. But the point is that. I didn't think anybody'd be interested in reading them, so I wasn't brave. That is, I didn't think about publishing them.
You didn't.
If I had said to myself, I'm going to publish these stories and I'm going to be brave and write them and throw them out into the world, something like that, I didn't think like that at all. I just said, I have to write these damn stories.
Well, I went.
And then I began to write them. And then...
Okay, so you said you'd pretty much been sold on the idea that you weren't writing important, serious stuff.
Yeah, I thought, that the first book came out in '59, which means that some of the stories written in the mid-'50s. It's a very masculine period. Even the whole avant-garde, or whatever it's called, of the period, which was the Beats. I mean, it was very much a guy thing, a boy thing, and.